So the way I would read you then, and this is actually how it could correlate with some defense of certainly like a social democratic state as it's under siege from neoliberalism from the 70s to today.
Right.
That this starts to correlate very specifically with the prospect of a mass politics. Because if you're basically saying, and this is the kind of incredible dual role that I get from reading you, that these discourses that can sound so radical, but then they end up reifying. I mean, basically, look, if the only position that we can have is our own enclosed space and absolutely micro-specific way of experiencing the world, the only upshot of that is just relating to the world through this thing.
Right. Yeah.
I can plan, I can tailor all of my content, I can never come across any kind of experience in that temporal realm, which is only getting reinforced by this fucking coronavirus.
Oh yeah.
That ever steps out of that. And so that, and it, you know, that the notion that one's subjectivity can also get run and be in a feedback with other people's truths as well as objective truths and shared aspirations.
Right.
That you sort of can't do something like, let's just make it really concrete, build the, you know, a campaign for single payer in South Carolina.
No.
You can't organize to achieve a broad-based objective that might benefit the overwhelming mass of human beings, because nothing can be achieved outside of that restricted space. And then if nothing can be achieved, then the societal defaults that benefit those who have power anyways will just run themselves.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, I mean, for them, right? It's not so great for us, but it works very, very well for them.
What is the difference between one thing that I've heard that's a interesting, or you know, maybe it's not that interesting pushback, but I think it's a distinction that gets kind of collapsed, is if you go in and if you start to say that particularly racism as we experience it in modern, in the United States in 2020, that the history of it is even, you know, with all of the differences at different historical points and making it a more nuanced conversation, but the origins of it do go back to the Victorian stuff that you were talking about before, that basically if we're going to go out and rape and pillage and steal people's shit, we're going to create scientific and religious stories that generate narratives of their subhumanity to justify stealing their shit and murdering them and enslaving them. And and you can make this point, and again, the reason that this is an important point to make is that, I mean, there's nothing exculpatory about that at all. That's quite evil, in fact, if you want to use that terminology. But it puts us in the realm of politics. It puts us in the realm of economics. And I'll hear some, folks on the kind of liberal side that want to say that this stuff is trans-historical, can't be complicated at all. They'll say like, well, okay, but what about I don't know, an ancient civilization and two people encounter each other and they don't like the cut of each other's jibs. Like, isn't there something that's just innate or essential to human nature? Yeah. And I'd just like you to tee off on the real distinction. I mean, I'll throw in, I always think of the Chinese. I mean, in the ancient Chinese empire, they had this great phrase. I read it translated once, that they called their foreign policy barbarian management, which I thought was hilarious. But there were times.
Well, there you go.
Good one. Yeah. I hope that's true. We're going to be heading into another phase of that over the next coming decades. But they, they burned their own ships at one point.
Liberal.
What?
I just said, and goddamn, I thought the Ottomans weren't fucking liberal, but
right. But talk about that difference between human beings basically maybe being wary of each other because of kind of like eyeball differences that might, relate to like a state of childhood that you go, ooh, like there's somebody else, what's going on there, versus the scientific capitalist project of classifying other humans that, I don't see how you could separate that from what started to happen in the, 17th century, 18th, 18th century.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, the first thing I would say to that liberal is stop watching fucking alley-oop cartoons, right? Because that's not the way that things were back in the day either, right? So often, and it's like it's like an issue that trips up a lot of people. Often people I wouldn't have expected to be tripped up. So it's kind of like a category error, right? And like this is where it's kind of helpful that we are a species that thinks and expresses ourselves through taxonomies, right? Because you can say, ethnocentrism it could be like a human universal, maybe. I'm not prepared to grant that, necessarily, but except for this conversation, or except at a level of abstraction at which it's true but trivial, right? Because how do you know what the ethnos is or the ethnoi is in contradistinction to the other? Well, you don't really until you express it. So that's when you call it ethnocentrism, right? But it doesn't have to be that, right? But like if one is the sort who likes to play around with transhistorical categories, right? You could say that, in all societies, so far as we know, there are we and they boundaries, and there's some difficulty in traversing them. Now, human societies have operated in a whole lot of different ways over time and space. And it turns out that most of the time, those what we would think of as like tribal-like boundaries are very permeable. But again, like if you want to have the Brits, 19th century fantasy of what happened on the Pleistocene, right? You can play around with that. But even if that is a universal or a natural tendency, right? That doesn't really give you the tools to explain how the tendency is expressed in particular forms in different places and different historical periods, right? How could, there be Franco-German tensions in like 1830 before there was either France or fucking Germany, right?
Right.
And the whole notion of primordial hatreds is one that emerges from this fantasy, right, of primordial ethnocentrism. Ultimately, I think that a lot of that stuff, and there's actually like a cool work on origins stories, right, among anthropologists, but among archaeological anthropologists in particular. But the idea that there's a trans-historical disposition to dislike people who aren't like you. Well, in the first place, what not being like you means has evolved and changed radically over time, right? There's a lot of good work that shows that people didn't start to recognize countenances, right? Or at least not in Europe, which is where, in a way, all of us are from, right? But people, all right, so that's going to get some shit clicking. But
Definitely. I would just like to say we're all from Africa in contrast.
Well, ultimately, right.
Ultimately, yeah.
And see, that's the reason that I don't understand how this Ancestry.com bullshit works, right?
Right.
Right. Like, what the real punchline is going to be. East Africa, motherfucker, that's where you're from, right? But anyway.
We should retitle the show. The punchline is East Africa, motherfucker.
I think that'd be great.
That'd be a great title for the show, yeah.
Right, but there's a lot of work showing that people didn't even start to recognize one another by countenance in Europe until into the Enlightenment, right? And that's part of like the whole complex of cultural sea changes that would happen. So, I mean, how did you know that you didn't like an Alsatian, right? Like before there was even Alsace, right?
Right.
So I mean, there's that, right? And I think interestingly, the work that the alley-oop account does, right, is always presentist work, right? Like it's always intended not really to explain the historical past, but to justify right-wing tendencies in the historical present.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.